Nobody on the Broken Spur Ranch could say exactly when Marcus Malone had stopped being a man and started being something more like whether present, necessary, and entirely indifferent to whether anyone appreciated it. The Broken Spur sat 40 miles southeast of Abilene, Kansas, in the summer of 1873, a spread so vast that a man could ride from sunrise to high noon without ever seeing the same patch of grass twice. It ran 2,000 head of longhorn cattle across open land that smelled of dry earth and sage, and the particular sweetness of buffalo grass after rain. Elias Hooper owned it, or at least held the deed, though the hands who actually kept the place breathing would have argued that ownership was a flexible kind of word when your boots wore through twice a season, and your back never quite straightened before the next day's work began. Marcus Malone had been on the Broken Spur for 4 years by the time Lucy Abbott arrived, and in those 4 years he had built himself a reputation that preceded him into every bunkhouse, every saloon, and every argument about who ought to be trusted with the hardest assignments. He was 26 years old, broad through the shoulders, with hands so calloused they looked like leather strapping, and a jaw that seemed to have been carved from the same red sandstone that jutted out of the Kansas bluffs. He did not smile often. He did not complain at all. He could break a horse that had thrown every other man on the spread, rope a steer in conditions that made lesser riders curse and give up, and repair fence line faster and cleaner than men who had been doing it their entire lives. He was also, by unanimous agreement among the other ranch hands, the roughest man on the entire spread. Not rough in the way that meant cruel, though there were men in Abilene who had made the mistake of thinking so, and had come away from the encounter considerably humbler. He was rough the way unworked timber is rough, useful, solid, full of potential nobody had bothered to shape carefully. He did not make small talk. He did not attend the Saturday dances at the Hooper house when Mrs. Hooper organized them. He ate his meals at the end of the long bunkhouse table, said almost nothing, and disappeared before the other men had finished their coffee. He did his work, and then more work on top of that, and in 4 years not a single man on the Broken Spur had thought to thank him for any of it. They used him the way you used a good tool. You were glad it was there. You did not thank a hammer. Elias Hooper was a practical man who understood that Marcus Malone cost him the same wages as 2 less capable hands and produced the output of 3. He also understood, with the instinct of a man who had run cattle since before the war, that there was something in Marcus that had never been given an outlet beyond labor. He did not think about this often enough to do anything useful with it. It was Hooper's wife, a stout and generally cheerful woman named Harriet, who first told him about Lucy Abbott. Her father passed in February, Harriet said over supper one evening in late April of 1873, while Elias was focused on his pork and cornbread. Clement Abbott, he had that farm outside of Lawrence. The bank took most of it for debts and the girl has nowhere to go. She's been staying with her cousin, but there's no room there for the long term. Hooper chewed. What are you suggesting, Harriet? I'm suggesting we need a housekeeper. Mrs. Greer is getting too old to manage the upstairs rooms and the kitchen both. Lucy Abbott is 22 years old and she knows how to cook, keep house, and manage herself. Her father raised her properly. Hooper put down his fork. A young woman. On a working ranch. A working ranch that has a proper house attached to it and a respectable owner and his wife, Harriet said, with the mild patience of a woman who had been winning arguments with her husband for 19 years. She would stay in the house with us, not in the bunkhouse. She would be perfectly safe. Hooper thought about it for the length of time it took him to eat the rest of his cornbread, and then he agreed, because he almost always agreed with Harriet in the end and they both knew it. Lucy Abbott arrived on the 3rd Thursday in May, on the stage from Abilene, with 2 leather trunks, a small wooden crate containing her mother's china, and the careful composure of a woman who had cried all the tears she intended to cry somewhere private, and was not prepared to cry any more of them in front of strangers. Marcus was in the yard when the wagon came back from town. He was repairing the gate hinge on the main corral, crouched in the dirt with a hammer and a length of iron strap, and he looked up once when the wagon rolled in, registered a woman sitting in the back with two trunks, and went back to what he was doing. He noted that she was slight and fair-haired, and that she sat with her back straight even after what must have been a long and dusty ride. He did not note any of this consciously. He simply registered it the way he registered everything, quietly, completely, and without attaching any particular significance to it. What he could not have anticipated, because nothing in his experience had prepared him for it, was what happened approximately 40 minutes later. He had finished with the gate and was coiling the leftover iron strap to return to the tool shed when he heard footsteps behind him. Light ones. He turned. The woman from the wagon was standing 5 feet away from him, holding a tin cup of water. She had changed out of her traveling dress into a simpler one, pale yellow with small brown buttons, and her fair hair was pinned up at the back of her neck. Her eyes were the color of creek water in summer, more green than anything else, but with light moving in them. She looked at him steadily, without nervousness, which was unusual. Most people who approached Marcus Malone did so with at least some uncertainty about what they would get back. "Mrs. Hooper told me your name is Marcus," she said. Her voice was clear and a little lower than he had expected. "I'm Lucy Abbott. I saw you working on that gate hinge when we came in. That gate was giving everyone trouble all spring, apparently. Anyway, I thought you might want some water. It's warm out." She held out the tin cup. Marcus looked at it. He looked at her. He could not recall the last time anyone had brought him water when he was working, or done anything for him at all that was not strictly required by their own interests. He stood there for a moment that stretched out strangely, the afternoon heat pressing down, the smell of hay and dust all around them, and then he took the cup. "Thank you," he said, because there was nothing else that fit. "You're welcome," she said simply, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world, and went back toward the house. Marcus drank the water. It was cold from the well and tasted of iron and limestone, the way Kansas water always did. He stood there after she had gone and could not have explained, even to himself, why such a small and simple thing had lodged itself so thoroughly in his chest. He went back to work. That was what he always did. But something had shifted, quietly, the way a hinge shifts when it has been properly reset, not dramatic, barely visible, but absolutely real. The Broken Spur in summer was a machine that ran on muscle and routine. The hands were up before sunrise, the cook had coffee on before that, and by the time the eastern sky went from black to the particular bruised purple that preceded dawn, men were already moving toward the corrals and the pastures and the endless catalog of things that needed doing. Marcus was always the first of the hands awake, sometimes by half an hour, sometimes more. He had never needed much sleep. His body ran on work the way some men's ran on whiskey. Lucy Abbott, he discovered within the first week, was also an early riser. He came around the corner of the house on a Tuesday morning, heading for the tool shed, and found her sitting on the back steps in the gray pre-dawn light with a cup of coffee and what appeared to be a list she was writing in a small notebook. She looked up. She did not seem startled. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," he said, and kept walking. He thought that was the end of it. But on Wednesday she was there again, and on Thursday, and by Friday he had begun to expect her there, which bothered him a little because he had not consciously decided to expect anything. On Friday she called out to him as he passed. "There's coffee in the kitchen. Mrs. Hooper won't be up for another 20 minutes. You're welcome to it." He stopped. He considered saying no. He considered saying nothing at all and simply continuing to the tool shed. Instead, he turned and went to the kitchen and poured himself a cup of coffee, and Lucy Abbott came in behind him and poured herself a second cup and sat at the kitchen table, and neither of them said anything for a while. It was the most comfortable silence Marcus had experienced in 4 years. "You were up on the north pasture yesterday," Lucy said eventually, not as a question. "I saw you from the kitchen window. You were repairing something on the water tank. Leak in the base. It's been losing water since February. Did you fix it?" Yes. She looked at him over her coffee cup with an expression he couldn't quite read. It was attentive is what it was, like she was actually listening, actually filing the answer away somewhere. Good, she said. The cattle have been having to walk too far to the South Creek. I heard Mr. Hooper mention it. Marcus did not know what to do with the fact that she had been thinking about the water situation on the North Pasture. He drank his coffee and said, "You've been here a week." "Long enough to understand what needs doing," she said, without arrogance, just as a matter of fact. He looked at her then, really looked at her, for the first time with enough attention to take in the whole of her face rather than just the outline. She had a small scar through her left eyebrow, a line of pale white against her tan skin, as if she had caught something sharp there years ago. Her hands around the coffee cup were not the soft hands of a woman who had been kept from hard work. They were capable hands, with a little roughness at the fingertips and a faded callus on the inside of her right thumb. She had been doing her share of labor long before she came here. "Your father had a farm," he said. She glanced up. "Yes, outside Lawrence. About 300 acres, mostly wheat and some corn. We lost it in March." She said it without drama, as if she had already worked out the emotional arithmetic on the subject and completed the transaction. "He was a good farmer, he just had bad luck with the bank." "I'm sorry," Marcus said. He had not said that to anyone about anything in a long time. She looked at him again with that attentive expression. "Thank you, Marcus," she said. "That's kind." He stood up, put his cup in the basin, and went out to the tool shed. But the shape of the morning had changed around him somehow. The way the landscape changes after rain, even when the sky is clear again. Something softened, something opened, some quality of the air that was different from before. The weeks in early summer settled into a rhythm. Marcus worked the land with the same tireless intensity he always had, but he found himself doing things he had never done before, small recalibrations to his daily movement that always seemed to result, without quite meaning to, in him passing near the house at hours when Lucy Abbott might be visible. He told himself this was not what it was. He told himself he simply happened to be working near the kitchen garden when she was tending it, happened to need the tool from the shed closest to the back door when she was sweeping the porch, happened to ride in from the North Pasture at the particular hour when she was hanging laundry in the side yard. He was, in point of fact, not a stupid man. He knew exactly what was happening. He simply lacked any prior experience with it, and therefore any framework for what to do next. The other hands had noticed Lucy Abbott in the way that men on a working ranch always notice a young woman in their midst, with attention that ranged from respectful to considerably less so. A man named Gus Party, who was the Broken Spur's second-best roper and its most reliable source of trouble, had taken to finding excuses to be near the house. He was handsome in a sharp-featured way and knew it, and he had a way of talking to women that he believed to be charming and that Marcus found deeply irritating, though he could not have said why it should bother him. One afternoon in late June, Marcus came around the corner of the barn to find Party leaning against the corral fence talking to Lucy, who was on her way back from the kitchen garden with a basket of vegetables. Party was using that particular tone, low and self-satisfied, angled toward the familiar, and Lucy was listening with a polite expression that did not quite reach her eyes. Marcus did not slow his stride. He walked past both of them, said, "Party, Hooper wants those south fence posts reset before sundown," which was completely true and which Party had apparently been avoiding all afternoon, and continued to the barn without a backward glance. There was a brief pause behind him. "I'd better get to that," Party said, in a rather less charming tone. Marcus heard Lucy's quiet footsteps resume in the direction of the house. He stood in the dim cool of the barn for a moment and breathed out slowly through his nose and did not examine why he felt better. Lucy found him in the barn 20 minutes later. He was checking the hooves of a gray gelding that had been favoring its left front leg. "That was kind of you," she said from the doorway. "He wasn't listening when I told him I had work to get to." Marcus kept his eyes on the gelding's hoof. "He doesn't listen well generally." "No, I could see that." She paused. I can take care of myself, you know. I grew up on a working farm. I know what men like that are about." "I know you can," he said. He set the hoof down carefully and straightened. "I wasn't suggesting you couldn't." She was quiet for a moment, studying him with that attentive look. "I didn't think you were," she said at last. "I just wanted you to know." He nodded. She started to turn away, then stopped. "You never come to the dances on Saturday evenings." It was not quite a question. He said, "No." "Why not?" He thought about it, which was unusual. Normally he would have said something brief and sufficient to end the conversation. But she was looking at him with genuine curiosity, not prying, not judging, just actually interested in what he would say, and he found that her attention made him want to actually answer. "I don't know how to dance," he said. "And I don't know how to talk to people very well in that kind of setting, so I stay out of it." She tilted her head slightly. "I could teach you, the dancing part at least. The talking part is harder to teach. I don't need to learn to dance." "Maybe not," she said, "but it might be nice to have the option." She went back to the house. Marcus looked at the gelding, who looked back at him with the enormous liquid patience of horses. He did not go to the next Saturday dance. But the week after that, when he was passing the kitchen in the early evening and heard Lucy humming something with a beat to it as she washed up, he slowed his step, just for a moment, and listened. And he thought about what she had said, might be nice to have the option, and something in his chest, that place where the tin cup of water had lodged weeks ago, moved a little. July came on hot and relentless, the way it always did on the Kansas plains, pressing down from a sky that bleached itself nearly white by noon. The cattle needed constant management. The water sources required checking, and in some cases expanding, and the grass on the eastern pasture came in shorter than it should have after a dry June. Marcus worked from 4 in the morning until full dark most days, and he ran the other hands hard alongside him, not cruelly but with a no-nonsense efficiency that they had all long since stopped arguing with. One evening in the middle of July, just after supper, he was at the trough outside the barn washing the day's grime from his face and arms when he heard a sound that made him go very still. It was a low sound, controlled, the kind of sound a person makes when they are trying very hard not to make a sound at all. He raised his head. Lucy was sitting on the wood pile at the side of the barn. In the thickening dusk she was almost invisible, a pale shape with her head bent and her shoulders drawn in on themselves, and the sound she was making was the sound of someone crying with a great deal of discipline applied to it. He stood there for a long moment. His experience with crying women was essentially zero. His instinct was to withdraw, to give her the privacy she was obviously trying to maintain. He took one step back. Then he stopped. He walked to the wood pile and sat down on the far end of it, 3 feet away from her, and said nothing. She went still immediately. He felt rather than saw her lift her head and look at him. After a moment, she took a careful breath. "I'm sorry," she said very quietly. "I didn't know anyone was out here." "Don't apologize," he said. Silence. The evening insects had started up in the grass, a high persistent sound all around them. "I received a letter today," she said after a while, "from my father's sister. She wrote to tell me that my cousin, my father's side, Thomas, who I was very close to growing up, he passed in April. Fever." She paused. "I didn't know. I was traveling and the letter took months to find me." He was 24 years old. Marcus said nothing. There was nothing sufficient to say, and he knew that most of what people said in these moments was not actually for the person grieving but for the person who felt helpless to watch it. He sat still and let the silence be what it was. After a long while, Lucy said, "You don't fill every silence with words." "No, that's unusual, is it? Most people do. They mean well, but it makes it harder somehow, the talking." "I know," he said. And he did know from his own version of it, though it had looked different for him. She looked at him again. In the dim evening light, her eyes were darker, the grief in them something she had stopped trying to hide. "What do you do with it?" she asked. "With loss, what do you do with it when it's too big?" He thought about that honestly. "I work," he said, "until I'm too tired to feel anything at all, and then I sleep, and then I work again. Eventually the thing you're carrying gets smaller or you get stronger, I'm not sure which. That's very honest, she said. It's not very comforting. No, she said, but I'm tired of comfortable things that aren't true. She looked out at the dark line of the pasture. I think I needed someone to be honest with me. They sat on the wood pile until the stars were fully out, not talking much, just being present in the same space. When Lucy finally stood and said she ought to go in, she looked at him in a way that was different from every other time she had looked at him, like she had found something she had not expected to find and was not sure yet what to do with it. "Thank you, Marcus," she said, "for sitting with me. You don't need to thank me for that." "I know I don't need to," she said. "I want to." He watched her go into the house, and then sat on the wood pile alone for a while longer, looking at the stars, feeling the particular weight of a feeling he did not have a name for that had settled over him like a second skin. In the weeks that followed the evening on the wood pile, something changed between them that had no clear demarcation, no single moment where it turned, just a gradual accumulation of shared mornings and small exchanges, and the particular awareness of another person that, once established, is almost impossible to unfasten. Lucy began leaving a second cup of coffee on the kitchen counter in the mornings. He took it without comment. She did not make a ceremony of it. It simply became a fact of the early morning, like the sound of the rooster or the smell of the biscuits Mrs. Greer started at 5. He found, to his own considerable surprise, that he was talking more. Not to anyone else, to Lucy. In the kitchen before the house woke, or on the back steps in the early evening, or in the barn when she came to bring one of the horses a carrot from the kitchen garden that she said with great seriousness was medicinal. He talked about the land, the things he noticed in it, the way the dry summer was stressing the creek on the northern boundary, and what might be done about it. She talked about the household, about Mrs. Greer's knees, about the letter she was writing to her aunt, about a recipe for salt pork that she had adapted from something her mother used to make. They talked about his years before the Broken Spur, sparse information, offered carefully, and about her father's farm, about the wheat fields that had run gold in August, about what it was like to lose a place you had grown up in. "Were you born here, in Kansas?" she asked one morning. "Missouri," he said. "Grew up west of the river. Left when I was 17. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "There was nothing to stay for," he said, which was the shortest version of a longer and darker story that he had never told anyone and did not intend to. She seemed to understand that. She did not push. She looked at him with those creekwater eyes and said, "Some places hold you and some places let you go. I think Kansas is a letting go kind of place." "I've always thought that," he said, surprised. "I never said it quite like that," she smiled. It was the first full smile she had directed at him, not the polite professional smile she used with the hoopers and the hands, but a real one with warmth behind it, and it hit him somewhere in the sternum like something thrown hard and accurately. He looked away before she could read whatever had just happened on his face. But the smile had happened, and it stayed in his memory with the same persistent clarity as the tin cup of water, and the cold coffee in the blue-gray morning, and the sound of her crying on the wood pile, and the particular way she said his name, Marcus, with a slight emphasis on the first syllable, as if the word itself meant something more than a name. He spent a great deal of time that August not thinking about these things. He was remarkably successful at not thinking about them for intervals of 2 to 3 hours at a time. The trouble came in the form of a man named Dolan. Reed Dolan was a rancher from the neighboring spread to the south, a man of about 45 with the kind of money that had been old long enough to smell like righteous inheritance, and the kind of manner that came with believing your own worth was self-evident. He had been making offers on the Broken Spur's southern pasture for the better part of 2 years, and Elias Hooper had declined all of them with the weary politeness of a man who has declined the same offer too many times to remain fully cordial about it. Dolan came to the Broken Spur on a hot afternoon in early August with 2 of his men and a smile that had no humor in it, and Hooper received him on the porch while Marcus, who had been working the corral, moved to the far end of it but did not move away. He heard fragments, offer, final terms, not negotiable, and then, more quietly, Hooper's voice going flat and hard the way it did when he was actually angry rather than merely irritated. "I think you'd better ride back, Mr. Dahlin." Dahlin and his men left. Hooper came down the porch steps looking aged about 10 years and stood in the yard with his hands at his sides for a moment. Marcus walked over because Hooper was the kind of man who needed things to be useful rather than sympathetic. What did he want? Hooper looked at him. Same thing he always wants. He's up the pressure is all. Says he has a claim dispute he can bring to the county over the southern boundary. It's nonsense, but legal nonsense costs money to fight. "Do you want me to ride the southern line?" Marcus said. "I can have the boundary markers documented before the week is out." Hooper looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "I'd appreciate that, Marcus." It was, Marcus noted distantly, the first time in 4 years that Elias Hooper had addressed him by his given name rather than just Malone. He filed that away without making much of it and went to saddle his horse. He was back from the southern pasture by late the next afternoon with a full survey in his notebook, every marker documented and measured, enough to demonstrate the legitimacy of the Broken Spur's boundary. When he came back into the yard, Lucy was on the porch and called out to him. "Mrs. Hooper has supper on. Mr. Hooper said if you came back in time, there was a place at the table for you." He had never eaten at the Hooper table. The hands ate in the bunkhouse. He stood in the yard covered in trail dust and looked up at her. "I need to wash up first," he said. "Then go wash up," she said, with the complete calm of someone stating the obvious. He ate supper at the Hooper table that evening for the first time in 4 years on the spread. Harriet Hooper put him at the end nearest the door, as if acknowledging that he might need the nearest exit. Lucy sat across from him. Elias was at the head and talked about the survey and the boundary issue, and Marcus contributed more to the conversation than he had contributed to any meal in recent memory. At one point, Lucy passed him the bread and their fingers touched briefly at the exchange. Nothing dramatic, just the edge of her fingers against the side of his hand, and he became abruptly, furiously aware of every detail of the room. The sound of the oil lamp, the pattern on the tablecloth, the smell of the pot roast, and Lucy Abbott's face across the table, which was wearing an expression of complete composure that told him absolutely nothing about whether she had noticed. After supper, as the evening came on and Hooper and Harriet went inside, Marcus and Lucy ended up on the porch steps. Not by design, or not by any design that either of them had stated aloud. They simply both happened to be there, watching the last color go out of the western sky. "You did a good thing today," Lucy said. "Riding the boundary like that, it might save the ranch. It's what I'm here to do." "No," she said, with a gentleness that had something firm beneath it. "What you're here to do is herd cattle and fix fences and break horses. Caring about the ranch beyond your wages, doing the thing that needed doing before anyone asked you to, that's who you are. Those are different things." He looked at her. The last of the sunset was behind her and her hair had the particular warmth of summer light in it, and he thought with a clarity that felt dangerous, that he had never in his life met anyone who paid so much attention to him, not to what he was useful for, but to who he actually was. "You notice things," he said. "I've always noticed things," she said. "It got me in trouble when I was young. My father said I observed too much and said too little. I think he meant it as a criticism, but I took it as a compliment." "It is a compliment." She looked at him, and there was something in her expression now that was different, more still, more considered, as if she was deciding something. The silence between them was not the comfortable wordless silence of the early mornings. It had a different texture. "Marcus," she said. "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment and then she said, "Never mind," and looked back at the darkening sky. He wanted to tell her not to never mind, to say whatever she had been about to say. He did not, because he was not at all sure he was ready for it and he suspected she knew that, which was why she had stopped. But the word she had not said sat between them in the warm August dark like something alive. August wore on. The Dahlin situation did not resolve itself as tidily as Marcus's survey work suggested it should. Reed Dahlin, it transpired, had retained a lawyer from Topeka, a young man with soft hands and hard eyes who had filed paperwork contesting the southern boundary with the county land office. Elias Hooper rode to Abilene twice to speak with his own legal representative, and came back both times looking more tired. Marcus watched this with the particular attentiveness of a man who had made the ranch his purpose, because he had not yet found a better one, and who understood the land in the way you only can when you have poured 4 years of physical labor into it. He spent his own off-hours, the few he had, documenting everything he could find in the ranch's records that supported the boundary. Old correspondence from before Hooper's ownership, survey stakes he found buried under decades of grass growth, the remains of a stone fence line that predated the current boundary markers and confirmed their position. He brought all of it to Hooper one Sunday morning, laid out in careful order on the kitchen table. Hooper stood looking at it for a long time. His wife came in, looked, and pressed her hand briefly on Hooper's arm. Lucy, who had been helping with the kitchen, appeared in the doorway and looked at the papers, then at Marcus. Hooper said roughly, "I don't know when you had time to find all of this." "Evenings," Marcus said. There was a silence. Hooper looked at him, and there was something in that look not soft, not demonstrative, because Elias Hooper was not built that way, but it was a look that contained acknowledgement, real acknowledgement, the kind that meant something. "I'll have my lawyer look at all of this," Hooper said. "It may be exactly what we need." He paused. "This was above and beyond Malone," Marcus shrugged. "The ranch is worth keeping." When he turned to go, Lucy was still in the doorway, and she was looking at him with that expression he had come to think of as hers, quiet and attentive and entirely present. And her eyes were warm in a way that made his chest do that thing he was trying not to think about. "That was remarkable," she said quietly, so only he could hear. "It needed doing. It needed someone to care enough to do it," she corrected. And then softly, "You care about this place very much." "I care about what's fair," he said. She tilted her head. "I think you care about more than that." He went out to the yard before he could say anything in response to that, which was almost certainly the right decision. The legal matter resolved itself in Hooper's favor in late September, the Topeka lawyer apparently concluding that the documentation Marcus had found made the case not worth continuing. Dahlin was not finished making himself unpleasant, but the particular threat of losing the southern pasture was gone, and the relief on the Broken Spur was as palpable as a change in weather. Hooper, in a gesture that was unusual for him, gave the hands a Saturday off, a full Saturday with no assigned work, and the specific suggestion that they ride into Abilene if they liked. Most of them did. Marcus did not. He was in the barn with the gray gelding, who had been off his feed for 3 days, and whom Marcus had been monitoring with an attention that the animal probably did not deserve and absolutely received, when he heard Lucy's step. He had learned her footsteps. He was aware of this with a mild exasperation directed entirely at himself. "Everyone's gone," she said, leaning on the stall door. "Even Mrs. Greer went to visit her daughter in town. Mrs. Hooper is having a nap. Mr. Hooper is in his study." "I know," he said, running his hand along the gelding's flank. "Are you going to stay with the horse all afternoon?" "He's not well." "He seems well enough to me," she said. "He was eating when I came through an hour ago." Marcus looked at the horse, who did look better, he had to admit. "Maybe so." "I was going to walk out to the cottonwood grove by the creek," Lucy said. "The one along the north pasture, Mrs. Hooper said the last of the summer wildflowers are still out. I thought I'd like to see them before they're gone." She paused. "I'd like some company if you're willing." He looked at her. She was wearing a plain blue dress today and a straw hat against the September sun, which was still strong though the heat had begun to come out of it. Her expression was simply hopeful, no artifice in it, no complicated agenda. He put the gelding's brush on the hook and said, "All right." They walked to the cottonwood grove along the north pasture in the afternoon light, and it was, Marcus would think afterward. One of the longest stretches of time he had spent just walking with another person rather than working alongside one. The land was golden in early autumn, the grass going from summer green to the warm tawny color that preceded the brown of winter, and the cottonwood leaves had just begun to turn at their edges, a yellow that caught the low sun and held it. Lucy walked alongside him with the easy stride of someone accustomed to covering ground, and she talked about the seasons on her father's farm, about the way autumn smelled like wood smoke and drying corn, about the particular quality of sky in October on the prairie that she had never seen anywhere else. She asked him questions and listened to his answers with that full attention that he had still not gotten used to, even after months of it. At the cottonwood grove, which was beautiful, the wildflowers still persisting in the shelter of the trees even as the open fields had given them up, she stopped and turned slowly, taking it in. And Marcus watched her take it in, watched the pleasure on her face, the way she bent to look at a cluster of purple aster, the way the light came through the moving cottonwood leaves and made patterns on her upturned face, and he felt something settle in him with the finality of something that had been held in suspense for a very long time. He was in love with her. He did not know exactly when it had become this complete, this undeniable. The tin cup of water felt like the beginning of a sentence that had been working toward this conclusion all along. He stood in the cottonwood grove in the September afternoon with his hands at his sides and looked at Lucy Abbott and felt the weight of it, enormous and terrible and the most alive thing he had felt since he could remember. She turned and found him watching her and said nothing for a moment. "It's beautiful," she said quietly, but she was looking at him when she said it. "Yes," he said, and did not look away. Something moved across her face, a quick warmth, something that looked almost like relief, as if she had been waiting for confirmation of something she had suspected but not been certain of. She turned back to the flowers, and he thought she was going to let the moment pass, and then she said very quietly, "You are not what anyone thinks you are, Marcus Malone. What do they think I am?" "Hard," she said. "Rough, good for work and not much else." She looked at him over her shoulder. "That's not what I see." "What do you see?" he asked, and the words came out with more weight than he intended. She turned to face him fully, and her eyes were very steady. "I see a man who fixes things that need fixing before anyone asks him to. I see a man who sits on a wood pile in the dark with a person who's crying, without saying a single useless word. I see a man who spent his evenings finding paperwork that could save this ranch because it was the right thing to do." She paused. "I see a man who has never been thanked for any of it and who has gone right on doing it anyway." The cottonwood leaves moved above them in the light wind. The creek murmured some distance away. "You thanked me," he said, "for the water the first day you were here. That was the smallest of things." "It was the first time in 4 years," he said simply. She looked at him for a long time, and he watched her understand what that meant, watched the weight of it land on her. "I'm sorry that's true," she said. "Don't be sorry, it's just how it is." "It shouldn't be how it is," she said, and there was something fierce and tender in equal measure behind the words. He moved toward her very slightly, not closing the distance entirely, leaving it a question. "Lucy," he said. "Yes," she said, and he understood from the way she said it that she was answering more than the unspoken question. He reached out and took her hand very carefully, the way you handle something you have waited a long time for and are not entirely sure yet that you have the right to. Her fingers were warm and capable, and they closed around his with a sureness that undid the last of whatever resistance he had been maintaining. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "Any of this? I know," she said. "I don't think it matters that much. I think you just have to start and then continue." She was looking up at him with that full attention, that warmth, those creekwater eyes, and she said, "I think you're capable of anything you decide to be capable of. I've thought that since the first morning you sat across from me with your coffee." He brought her hand up and held it carefully between both of his. He was aware of how rough his hands were against hers, all calloused labor and sun-cracked skin, and he thought she might notice that too. She ran her thumb across his knuckles without looking down, as if she had noticed it and found it entirely beside the point. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if that's something you'd consider." She looked at him with the closest thing to radiance he had ever seen on a human face. "I would consider it very seriously," she said. They walked back from the cottonwood grove in the slant of the afternoon sun, their hands no longer joined, but the space between them entirely changed, charged with something warm and deliberate, a new set of possibilities that had not existed that morning. October came to the Broken Spur in a slow burn of gold and red, the cottonwoods fully turned now, the mornings carrying a chill that sharpened everything and made the coffee in the kitchen taste even better. The land was settling toward winter, the cattle rounded up and the head count taken, the supplies laid in with the particular urgency of a ranch that took seriously the reality of a Kansas winter. Marcus courted Lucy Abbott with the same thoroughness he brought to everything he did, which is to say with complete seriousness, careful attention, and a total absence of half-measures. He was not demonstrative in the way that Gus Party was demonstrative, all easy charm and careless flattery. What he offered instead was more difficult and more valuable, consistent presence, real attention, and the growing willingness to be known. He told her about Missouri, not everything, but more than he had told anyone. He told her about his father, who had been a hard man in ways that were not the good kind of hard, and about leaving at 17 with nothing but a horse and the contents of his pockets, and about the years between Missouri and Kansas that had been lean and often dangerous, and that he did not entirely regret because they had built something in him that he was glad to have. He told her about the first time he had worked cattle, how he had found in the rhythm of it something that felt like a purpose, a physical language that said everything the words he didn't have could not. She listened to all of it without flinching and without false comfort. She asked questions that were careful and precise, and that showed she was taking in not just the events but the meaning beneath them. She told him about her own years, the good ones on the farm, the death of her mother when she was 16, the years after when it was just her and her father and the wheat and the seasons, the quiet and capable life they had built together before the bank and the debt and the February that ended it. "You're not afraid of hard things," he said one evening, as the first frost of the season put itself on the windows of the barn where they had taken to sitting in the evenings out of the cold on overturned feed buckets with lantern light between them. "I'm afraid of them," she corrected. "I just don't let the fear make my decisions for me. There's a difference. Most people don't make that distinction. Most people haven't had to," she said. He looked at her in the lantern light, this woman who had lost her mother and her father and her home and a cousin she loved, who had come to a working ranch in the middle of Kansas with 2 trunks and her mother's china, and the determined composure of someone who had decided that grief would not be the whole of her story. And he thought, "This is the most remarkable person I have ever encountered." He said, "I think you're the most remarkable person I've ever encountered." She looked startled, genuinely, pleasantly startled, as if the words had come from a direction she hadn't expected. Then that real smile came out, the warm one, and she said, "That's the nicest thing you've ever said to me." "I mean every word I say to you," he said. "I don't have extra words to waste." "I know that," she said with great seriousness. "That's part of why it means what it does." He reached across the distance between their feed buckets and touched her face, the side of her jaw, just his rough fingertips against her cheek, and she leaned into it very slightly, just a fraction, and looked at him with eyes full of warmth and steadiness. He kissed her for the first time on a cold October evening in the barn, with frost on the windows and the horses quiet in their stalls and lantern light making everything amber and warm. It was not a tentative kiss. He was not capable of half measures, and he had been thinking about nothing else for weeks, but it was careful, in the way that careful and passionate are not actually opposites, and when he pulled back she was looking at him with a brightness in her expression that he wanted to be responsible for producing for the rest of his life. "Well," she said, slightly breathlessly. "Yes," he said. She laughed then, a genuine and delighted laugh, and he felt something in his chest unlock that had been shut for so long he had not fully realized it was shut. He told Elias Hooper the following week, because he was a man who believed in doing things directly, and because Hooper, whatever his limitations, deserved that respect. He knocked on the door of Hooper's study on a Sunday morning and said that he was courting Lucy Abbott with serious intentions and that he wanted Hooper to know. Hooper was quiet for a long moment, regarding him over the desk with the measuring expression of a man who is being asked to assess something he hadn't quite expected to be asked about. "Your intentions," Hooper said, "when you say serious." "I intend to ask her to marry me," Marcus said, "when the time is right, when she's had enough time to be sure." Hooper was quiet again. Then he said, "She's been here 6 months and she's already more necessary to this household than anyone I've hired in 15 years. My wife considers her family." He paused. "And you've been on this ranch for 4 years and you've never asked me for a single thing that wasn't about the work." "No," Marcus said. "I think that tells me enough," Hooper said. "You have my blessing for whatever that's worth." Marcus nodded. He started to rise. "Malone," Hooper said. He stopped. "What you did with the boundary documentation, the survey work, the 4 years before that." Hooper was looking at the desk rather than at him. "I should have said something long before now. You've kept this ranch running as much as anyone on this spread, and I've paid you well and thanked you poorly. I want to correct that." Marcus stood in the study doorway and felt the weight of those words, which were awkward and genuine in equal measure. The words of a man who was not naturally demonstrative but who had decided it mattered enough to try. "I appreciate that," Marcus said, and meant it. He rode out to the north pasture afterward in the cool October air and let the horse run for a while, just because the landscape and the speed and the cold air felt like the right accompaniment to the morning, to Hooper's words, to Lucy's face the night before in the lantern light, to the extraordinary improbable sense that his life was arranging itself into a shape that had room for more than work. November arrived, and with it, a development that nobody on the Broken Spur had anticipated. Gus Party, who had never entirely reconciled himself to the fact that Lucy Abbott had no interest in his particular brand of charm, had been drinking more heavily than usual in the weeks since Marcus and Lucy had become visibly a pair. He had made several remarks in the bunkhouse that Marcus had heard and chosen not to address, partly because the other hands had addressed them on his behalf in ways he found adequate, and partly because Party was more pathetic than threatening. What happened in November was neither pathetic nor threatening in itself, but it created a situation. Party, apparently in a fit of pique or whiskey-inspired recklessness or both, had let it be known in Abilene that the Broken Spur's boundary documentation was, in his words, suspicious in its origins. He had said this to the wrong person, who happened to be connected to Reed Dahlan, who was still smarting from the loss of his legal challenge. Word reached Hooper through a neighbor, and Hooper called a meeting of the hands in which he was very calm and very clear about what the consequences would be for anyone who undermined the ranch's interests for personal reasons. Party, who was not a stupid man, understood the implications and left the Broken Spur the following morning with his wages and his horse, which was a more generous outcome than Marcus, had he been running things, would have arranged. After Party rode out, Lucy found Marcus at the corral fence. "I'm sorry that any of that happened on account of," she began. "It didn't happen on account of you," he said. "It happened on account of Party not being able to manage his own dignity. Those are not the same things." She looked at him. "Sometimes I forget that you're very logical. It's useful sometimes. It's useful often," she said. "And then, I want you to know that none of this, none of the complications, changes anything for me. I want you to know that clearly." He turned from the fence and looked at her. "I want you to know the same," he said. She nodded. "I do know it," she said, with a certainty that he trusted completely. The winter settled over the Broken Spur in December with the full weight of a Kansas winter, deep cold, ground iron-hard. The wind coming off the flat land from the northwest, with nothing to slow it for 100 miles. The cattle had been moved to the winter pasture. The hands had shifted to indoor maintenance and feeding rounds, and the ranch had contracted into its cold-weather self, smaller and more interior. Marcus and Lucy found their rhythm in it. The long evenings created time in a way the summer had not, and they sat with Hooper and Harriet by the fireplace some evenings, talking, playing cards, occupying the domestic space with a naturalness that had grown into something genuinely familial. On other evenings they sat alone in the kitchen after the Hoopers had gone to bed, with the stove warm and coffee on, and the conversation that ranged from practical to personal with the ease of two people who had learned each other's language. "What do you want?" she asked him one December evening, the question simple and direct in the way her questions always were. "In what sense?" "All of them," she said. "What does Marcus Malone want from his life? If you could draw it out the way you survey a pasture, what would the shape of it be?" He thought about it carefully because she deserved a careful answer. "Land," he said. "Not much but mine, something I've built and can stand on." "Work that means something, not just labor, but work that grows into something over years." He paused. "A home that has warmth in it, not just heat from a stove." He looked at her. "That last part is new. I didn't used to think about it." She was very still, watching him. "It's new because of you," he said, because he was a man who had learned that the truth stated plainly was better than the truth wrapped up in protection. "Everything I want the shape of my life to look like is clearer because of you. You're in all of it." She reached across the table and took his hand and held it on the surface of the table between hers and said, "Good, because so are you, in all of it." The cold deepened in January 1874, and the ranch kept itself going with the particular stubborn endurance of working places in hard weather. Marcus led the feeding rounds every morning regardless of the temperature, and came in from them with ice in his eyebrows that Lucy, with magnificent matter-of-factness, would sometimes brush away with the back of her hand when he came into the kitchen, a gesture so casually intimate that it made the other hands who occasionally witnessed it avert their eyes and rediscover something important in their coffee. It was on a Sunday in late January, during one of those rare quiet days when the feeding was done and the cold had slacked slightly and the light came in thin and white through the kitchen windows, that Marcus asked Lucy to marry him. He did not make a ceremony of it. He was not a man who made ceremonies. He set his coffee cup down and he looked at her across the kitchen table and he said, "I want you to be my wife, Lucy. I want to build something with you. I want to be the person you come home to and the person you leave in the morning and the person who is there through all the things in between. I want that more than I have ever wanted anything." She looked at him, and her eyes were full, not with tears that would fall, but with the kind of fullness that comes from something arriving that you have been moving toward without knowing exactly how close you were. "Yes," she said. "I want all of that, yes." He came around the table and took her hands and held them and said, "I don't have a ring yet. I'll get one." "I don't need a ring," she said, though she said it in a way that suggested she would not be entirely opposed to one. He got her one anyway, 2 weeks later, from a jeweler in Abilene, simple gold with a small garnet, red as a canyon at sunset, because it reminded him of the land, and the land reminded him of her, or something like that which he could not entirely articulate but which felt right. When he put it on her hand, she looked at it for a moment and then looked up at him with that full, warm smile, the real one, the one that had hit him in the sternum on a morning in early summer and had not stopped hitting him since. "It's perfect," she said. "Good," he said. They were married in April of 1874, almost exactly a year after Lucy Abbott had arrived at the Broken Spur on the stage from Abilene with 2 trunks and her mother's china. The ceremony was held in the Hooper parlor, conducted by the pastor from Abilene who made the trip out on a Saturday. The hands attended in their cleanest shirts, which was most of them, and Harriet Hooper wept with the distinguished abandon of a woman who had seen this coming since approximately week 2 and was very satisfied to have been right. Lucy wore her best dress, deep green wool that she had pressed the night before, with her mother's small cameo brooch at the collar. She looked at Marcus when she said her vows with the same steady attention she had brought to everything, as if she was not just saying words but meaning each one with deliberate specificity. Marcus said his vows in a voice that was quiet and certain, and that did not waver, and when the pastor said he could kiss his bride, he cupped her face in his rough, calloused hands and kissed her with a gentleness that made every person in the Hooper parlor understand with total clarity that this was a man who had found the thing he had been looking for. Harriet cried harder. Elias Hooper shook Marcus's hand afterward with a grip that said more than most speeches and said, "I want to talk to you about something when things settle down." What Hooper wanted to talk about was a parcel of land. The northern section of the Broken Spur, 20 acres along the creek with good water and solid ground, which Hooper had been intending to develop for years and had never gotten to. He offered to sell it to Marcus at a fair price, to be paid out of his wages over time, saying only that a man who had given 4 years of honest labor to his ranch deserved the chance to work something that was his own, and that having Marcus on an adjacent property was worth more to the Broken Spur than the cash value of the parcel. Marcus stood in Hooper's study and looked at the deed, and felt something so large and quiet move through him that he could not speak for a moment. "I'll do right by it," he said finally. "I know you will," Hooper said. "You've done right by everything else." He and Lucy walked the 20 acres on a warm spring afternoon, walking the perimeter the way you survey a thing before you claim it, noting the creek and the cottonwood stand at the north corner and the swell of ground in the middle where a house could be built with a view of the plains in 3 directions. "Here," Lucy said, standing on the swell of ground with the wind moving her hair and the wide Kansas sky above her. "The house should be here." "Yes," he said. "He built it over the summer." Not alone, Hooper lent him 2 hands for the heavy work, and neighbors came out on a Saturday for the raising of the walls, because that was how things were still done in 1874 on the Kansas plains. Community assembled out of practical necessity and kept together by something more. Marcus worked on it every evening and every spare hour, and what went up was not large but was solid 2 rooms initially, with the clear bones of a larger structure around them, built to grow. Lucy made decisions about everything from the window placements to the interior layout with the same comprehensive attentiveness she brought to any problem, and Marcus found that having her in the planning of it made the building of it feel different from any work he had done before. It was not just labor. It was construction of the specific future they intended to inhabit together. They moved in at the end of September, 1874, carrying Lucy's mother's china very carefully across the yard and placing it on the new shelves Marcus had built along the kitchen wall. The ranch house was simple and plain and smelled of fresh-cut lumber, and the first evening they spent in it, sitting on the porch as the sun went down over the plain, Lucy leaned against Marcus's shoulder and he put his arm around her and they watched the light go out of the western sky over their own land. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I did not believe this was possible," he said, "a year ago." "Which part?" "Any of it." She lifted her head and looked at him. "Did I do that?" "Make it seem possible. You made me want to try," he said, "which was necessary first." She took his hand where it rested around her shoulder and held it, turning it over to look at the rough palm, the calloused fingers, the evidence of everything his hands had been put to over 26 years of working. She traced the lines of it with her fingertip. "These hands built this house," she said, "among other things." "Among all the things," she said softly, "every fence on the Broken Spur, every water tank, every gate hinge." She closed her fingers around his. "I'm glad I gave you that cup of water." He looked at her with everything he felt written plainly on his face, because after this long he had mostly given up the effort of concealing it, and he said, "So am I." They had, in the year that followed, more contentment than either of them would have predicted during the harder years that preceded it. They were not idle. A small ranch requires more work per acre than a large one because there are fewer hands to share it, but the work had a different quality when it was yours. Marcus found that he did not resent the labor, had never resented it exactly, but that now it had a flavor of investment and purpose that changed its entire character. Every post he drove, every line of fence he strung, every early morning round of the cattle, it all accumulated towards something he could see and name. Lucy ran the household and the kitchen garden, and as the spring of 1875 advanced, 3 additional acres that she had convinced Marcus to plow and plant with wheat. Her father's daughter, she understood the mathematics of drought and rain, the management of a small crop, the way to read weather on the horizon. The wheat came in good that first year, not spectacular but solid, and she stood at the edge of it in August and said, "My father would have been very pleased with this." Marcus stood beside her looking at the wheat and said nothing for a moment and then said, "Tell me about him again. The good things." She did. She talked about Clement Abbott for half an hour, standing in the August wheat on their own land, and Marcus listened with the full attention he had been giving her since the first morning in the kitchen, and she came to the end of it and looked at him and said, "Thank you for asking." "He was a part of who you are," Marcus said. "That means he matters." She tucked her face briefly against his shoulder, and he held her there in the wheat with the late summer light all around them and the plains stretching in every direction, and felt the rightness of it settle into him like something permanent. In late autumn of 1875, Lucy told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen on a Wednesday morning matter-of-factly, as was her way with important things, looking at him over the rim of her coffee cup with steady eyes that nonetheless held a certain quality of waiting. He went very still. "You're sure?" he said. "Quite sure." He set his coffee cup down and came around the table and knelt in front of her chair and took her hands and looked up at her, and she looked back at him with those warm eyes, and everything in him was very quiet and very large at once. "Are you all right?" he said. "I'm very well," she said. "I'm happy, Marcus, are you?" He pressed his forehead against her hands and said, muffled and fervent, "Yes, God, yes." She laughed, that genuine, delighted laugh, and put her free hand on his hair, and he stayed there for a moment, kneeling on his own kitchen floor, feeling the weight and the gift of everything his life had accumulated into. The winter of 1875 into 1876 was spent with Lucy's pregnancy advancing through the cold months, and Marcus becoming, if anything, more attentive to the world around him, checking the stove twice before bed, keeping the woodpile stacked twice as high as necessary, making unconscious circuits of the house in the evenings that he was entirely unaware of but that Lucy observed with a private amusement she shared with Harriet Hooper over tea. "He checks the door lock 3 times now," she told Harriet. Harriet, who had had 2 children with Elias and understood exactly what was happening, smiled with enormous warmth. "That means everything is exactly as it should be," she said. Their son was born in March of 1876, on a morning when the first thin warmth of early spring was in the air, and the crows were making noise in the cottonwoods along the creek. The birth was attended by a midwife from the nearest neighbor farm, a capable and brisk woman named Mrs. Clark who had midwifed half the children in that county, and had an opinion about everything, and was right about most of it. Marcus waited in the other room with his hands folded, and his elbows on his knees in the particular stillness of a man who is very frightened, and has decided that fear is not going to be useful. When Mrs. Clark opened the door and said, "Healthy boy, and your wife is fine," he stood up so fast he knocked the chair over and did not notice. He went to the bedroom door and stopped. Lucy was sitting up in the bed, pale with exhaustion but completely herself, the attentive eyes and the steady expression all present and accounted for, and she was holding the baby against her chest with the specific sureness of someone who had taken to a new skill with characteristic thoroughness. She looked up at him. "Come in," she said. "Come and meet your son." He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, who was red and small and had a remarkable amount of dark hair for someone who had been in the world for approximately 20 minutes and who was making small sounds that were not quite crying but were something more exploratory. "He looks like you," Lucy said, studying the baby with great seriousness. "He's very red." "That'll pass," Lucy said. "The hair won't. He has your hair." Marcus put his finger against the baby's fist, and the baby's fist closed around it with a grip that was, for its size, absolutely startling. "Hello," Marcus said very quietly. It was barely a whisper. He looked up at Lucy, and whatever was on his face made her reach out and touch his jaw with the back of her hand, the same gesture she used in the mornings when he came in from the cold. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He covered her hand with his. "That I have everything," he said. "I never thought I would have everything." They named the boy Thomas, after Lucy's cousin who had died young, because that was what she had said she wanted when she thought about boys' names. And Marcus said that was right, that was good, that a name like that would carry something forward that deserved to be carried. Thomas Malone grew into a solid and bright-eyed infant, and then a toddler who pursued every corner of the house, and the yard with the insatiable curiosity of a very healthy child. And Marcus, who had no prior experience with children and had frankly anticipated finding it bewildering, discovered that he was entirely undone by fatherhood in the best possible way. He was patient with the child in a way that surprised even him, patient and consistent and quietly devoted, reading to Thomas in the evenings from the 2 books they owned, teaching him the names of the horses and the cattle and the birds on the fence line. Lucy watched him with Thomas and felt something she recognized as the specific happiness of having your good judgment confirmed, of having seen something clearly and had reality agree with you. The Broken Spur continued its work on the adjacent land, and Marcus continued to work for Hooper while also developing his own property, a dual arrangement that suited everyone because Marcus's additional knowledge of the land and the cattle benefited both operations, and because Hooper was a man who understood the value of an invested neighbor rather than simply a paid hand. The relationship between them had shifted over the years into something that was not quite friendship. Hooper was not built for friendship in the conventional sense, but was mutual respect of the deep and tested kind, the respect that comes from a long shared history and a clean accounting on both sides. In the summer of 1877, a neighbor's barn burned in a lightning storm, and Marcus was the first on horseback to help, organizing the bucket lines from the creek, ensuring the animals were out, directing the efforts with the quiet efficiency that defined him. The neighbors, the Harden family, who had the farm 3 miles east, rebuilt with help from the community that fall. Mrs. Harden, a woman of considerable dignity and directness, took Lucy's hand at the end of the raising day and said, "Your husband is the reason we have a barn." Lucy said, "I know." "Does he know?" Lucy smiled. "He will when I tell him." She did tell him that evening on the porch, and Marcus listened and said, "The Hardens would have done the same." "They would have tried," Lucy said. "You made it possible. There's a difference." He looked at the plain in the late evening light and said nothing for a moment. "Then you always make that distinction, the difference between trying and making something happen. Because it matters," she said. "You always see the difference in things." "You do too," she said. "You just don't say it." He turned and looked at her, this woman beside him in the summer evening, with the plains behind her and the cottonwoods in the distance and the lamplit window of their house throwing a warm square of light onto the porch boards, and said, "I say it to you." "Yes," she said, with complete satisfaction. "You do." The years settled into themselves with the particular richness of a life that has found its form. The farm grew, not dramatically, not in the spectacular way of ambition run wild, but steadily and with integrity, the way things grow when they are tended properly. The wheat was good in the good years and adequate in the dry ones, and Marcus's cattle management on his own small herd was efficient enough to make the operation viable even when prices ran low. Thomas became a boy who loved horses with a devotion that his father understood completely, and Marcus began teaching him to ride at 4, leading him around the yard on the old gray gelding, now ancient but still steady, with a patience and care that made Lucy stand at the kitchen window and feel the kind of love that has no adequate vocabulary for what it is. In the autumn of 1878, a second child arrived. Another boy, smaller and louder than Thomas had been, with Lucy's green eyes and Marcus's dark hair, who came into the world with what Mrs. Clark described as an opinion about the matter. They named him James, after no one in particular, but because it was a solid name that fit him. James was, from approximately his 4th month, a person who made himself very clearly heard, which Lucy took in stride and Marcus found occasionally astonishing given the volume capable of being generated from that small a body. "He has thoughts," Marcus said once, watching James inform the room of something with great conviction. "Many thoughts," Lucy agreed. "He gets that from somewhere." "Not from me," Marcus said. "No," she said with a perfectly straight face. "Absolutely not." He looked at her and she was trying not to smile, and he felt the warmth of it, the humor between them, the ease, the way they had worn the edges of each other into a specific and comfortable fit, and he thought that this, too, was something he had never known how to want until he had it. By 1880, the farm was fully established. The house had been expanded to 4 rooms with a proper parlor. The wheat field had grown to 8 acres, and the small cattle herd numbered 40 head. Marcus had built a reputation in the county not as the roughest hand on someone else's spread, but as one of the soundest farmers and most reliable neighbors in that part of Kansas, a man who could be counted on and who asked nothing more than an honest accounting in return. He still rose before sunrise. He still worked with the same thoroughness, the same absence of half-measures. The calluses on his hands were, if anything, deeper than they had been on the Broken Spur. Lucy still left a cup of coffee ready in the mornings. He still took it. That had not changed and would not change. It was the first act of their day, as much a part of the structure of their life as the sunrise it preceded. One morning in the early spring of 1880, Thomas, who was 4 years old and had inherited his mother's tendency to observe, and his father's tendency to act on what he observed, brought Marcus a battered tin cup of water from the well while Marcus was repairing the fence at the edge of the wheat field. Marcus stopped. He looked at the cup. He looked at Thomas, who was very serious about the transaction, holding the cup with both hands and watching his father with those attentive green eyes. He crouched down to Thomas's level and took the cup. "Thank you," he said. Thomas said, "You were working very hard, Papa." "I was," Marcus said. "Mama always brings you water when you're working very hard." "She does," Marcus said. "I thought I could do it too," Thomas said with great dignity. Marcus put his hand on the boy's head and held it there for a moment, and then stood and looked across the field to the house, where the morning light was on the windows and smoke was coming from the kitchen chimney, and the sound of James, who was apparently informing the world of something as usual, drifted out on the warm spring air. He drank the water. It was cold and tasted of iron and limestone, the way Kansas water always had, and it was the best thing he had ever tasted in his life. That evening, when the boys were in bed and the house was quiet, Marcus and Lucy sat on the porch in the early spring dark, close together, her head against his shoulder, his arm around her, the way they had learned to occupy the same space over years of practice. "Thomas brought me water today," he said. He felt her smile before he saw it. "I know," she said. "He told me he was very proud of himself." "He should be," Marcus said. She turned her head and looked up at him. Stars were out above the Kansas plain, enormous and numerous in the dark, and the cottonwood grove along the creek was a dark shape against the dark sky. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Your life, when you hold it up and look at it?" He thought about that for the full and honest moment it deserved. "It feels like enough," he said. "It feels like more than enough. It feels like the shape of something I couldn't have drawn out for myself, but that's exactly what I would have wanted if I'd known how to want it." He pressed his lips to her hair. "It feels like you." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, 7 years ago I handed a rough, silent man a cup of water because he'd been working hard and nobody had thought to do it. Yes, he said. I had no idea, she said softly, that it would lead here. Neither did I. Are you glad? He tightened his arm around her and looked at the stars and the plain and the dark line of the cottonwoods and the light in their window, and thought about the boy with his mother's eyes who had brought him water that morning, and the loud small boy asleep inside, and the woman against his shoulder who had seen him, really seen him, when he had been entirely invisible to everyone else, and who had said thank you for a cup of water and changed the entire course of something. I am the most glad I have ever been about anything, he said. I am glad every single day. She took his hand and held it the way she had the first time on a cold October evening in the barn, and they sat together in the spring dark on the porch of the house he had built on the land that was theirs, and listened to the night sounds of the Kansas plain, the wind, the distant cattle, the creek, the cottonwoods, and were, both of them, entirely and completely home. There was one more morning, some weeks later, that stayed with Marcus Malone for the rest of his days. He was out early, as always, in the blue-gray hour before the sun actually showed itself, doing the first round of the pasture. The frost was still on the grass, thin and white, and his breath made clouds in the cold air, and his horse moved steadily beneath him in the quiet. When he came back into the yard, the kitchen window was lit, golden against the pale morning. He could see Lucy's shape through the glass, moving at the stove. In a moment the back door opened and she came out onto the step in her coat and held out a tin cup. He rode up close to the step, leaned down from the saddle and took it. Their eyes met, his dark and hers that creek water green, and she smiled at him in the cold morning light. "Thank you," he said. The same words he had said the first time 7 years ago, meaning the same thing and everything more that had grown from it. "You're welcome," she said, the same words. As simple as the first time, as full as everything that had come after. He drank the coffee on horseback in the cold spring morning on his own land, watching the sun come up over the edge of the Kansas plain, and felt the warmth of it. The coffee, the land, the lit window. The woman in the doorway spread through him like something that had always been there, waiting to be found. The roughest hand on the Broken Spur had found his home, and the woman who had been the first in 4 years to thank him for anything had built it with him, piece by piece and morning by morning, out of good coffee and honest words, and the particular grace of two people who had learned to see each other clearly, and had liked enormously what they saw. The cottonwoods along the creek had leafed out fully now, bright spring green in the morning light, and the wheat field was showing its first green rows, and Thomas was already awake and visible at the bedroom window, watching his father ride in, and James was audibly, from here awake and informing his corner of the house about it. Marcus Malone rode in from the pasture on a cold spring morning in 1880, handed the empty cup back to his wife, and kissed her in the doorway of their house on their land, and then went inside to his family and to the particular, irreplaceable life that a cup of cold water and a woman who knew the difference between labor and love had made possible. It was enough. It was everything. It was, by any honest accounting, exactly what he deserved.